Hello and welcome to Maulana Azad National Urdu University. We have with us today Dr. Pramod Nair of the University of Hyderabad. He will talk to you on cultural studies and the new historicism. This lesson is based on Unit 5, Block 8 of Paper 5 and is for the MA English second year students.
In this session, we will be looking at cultural studies and the new historicism, two disciplines and critical formations that have emerged in the 1990s in the United Kingdom, Europe, later Australia and the United States. Cultural studies as a discipline emerged at the Birmingham Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies in the UK. In the first group of people were distinguished Marxist critics Raymond Williams, the authority on literacy Richard Hogarth, Stuart Hall, Tony Bennett, who would go on to become one of the world's biggest experts on museum studies, and Angela McRobbie. The initial moments were also in some sense formulated in the Department of Popular Culture at Bowling Green University, the USA, when it launched the Journal of Popular Culture in 1969. This journal still remains one of the world's top journals for popular culture studies. Culture, as defined by cultural studies, includes the following. It's a mode of generating meanings and ideas. All meanings are governed by power relations. By power relations, we are referring to power relations between the two genders, between races, between classes, and so on and so forth. Culture studies argues that elite culture, that is the culture of specific groups of people with money and power, controls meanings because they control the terms of the debate itself. What this means is non-elite or common views, the views of the masses on life and art are rejected as lacking in taste, as being useless or even stupid by the elite. This means some components of culture gain more visibility, more significance because they gain more meaning. Let us take a very common example. What you are seeing is a set of two visuals. The photograph in black and white behind is Agatha Christie. The one in front is of course William Shakespeare. Now, Agatha Christie is one of the world's largest read authors in the popular genre. William Shakespeare is the most respectable name in literature. What you are seeing here is the way in which Shakespeare overwhelms, overcomes and masks the more popular Agatha Christie. What does cultural studies actually look at? It looks at popular culture, mass culture, non-official culture and everyday life. It looks at things like graffiti, things that people write on the walls in universities, in the roadside walls, in public places and so on and so forth. It looks at comic books. It looks at mass cinema as opposed to art cinema. It looks at popular music as opposed to classical music. It also looks at the open spaces of the city as opposed to art galleries. It looks at sports and it looks at roadside eateries as opposed to the posh hotels. Popular culture can be defined as a set of practices, artifacts and beliefs shared by the masses. It is something constituted by the everyday life of the masses. It is not elite, it is not about class, it is not necessarily about taste, but it is something we all share every day. Now, cultural studies argues that all culture is produced. There is no such thing as a natural culture. Second, such culture forms, practices, beliefs is always about power. Take a look at the visual now. Let us take a look at how culture is formed, influenced by several structures around it. In the center you have something called culture. Cultural issues, themes are mediated through questions of economy, that is about profit, who makes the money, and questions of politics, who holds power. Culture in this visual is influenced by, is determined by the government, which passes regulations and rules, the censors that determine what is acceptable and what is not, the police, that is the law and order system, which punishes you for behaving in certain ways that are deemed to be unacceptable. Then of course, there is the media that enables the large scale dissemination of any cultural form. It could be the movies, it could be television, it could now of course be the internet. Finally, there are the corporate sponsors that actually give you the money, media production company, the movie house, Hollywood, whatever, which generates profits as well. In order to understand how culture operates, cultural studies looks at two components, the production and consumption of culture. The production and consumption of culture can be linked to a specific set of matters, matters of class, which will ask a question, who decides what is to be produced? Matters of economy, that is, who can afford it, who makes the profits from it. Then matters of representation, how is the artifact being marketed or presented to you if you are the buyer. Take a look at some of the things that are now appearing on your screen. On the left is the awards function, the most famous awards function I must say, the Oscar ceremony, which includes the much revered Oscar statuettes, and the Central Board of Film Certification, which authorizes what we see. There is a list about this that you might want to look at. The government approves or prohibits a piece of work, whether it is a book or a film. The sponsors provide the money, the funds, or it refuses to give you the funds, and the mass media which reports. The reviews, the critics who tell you this is a good movie to watch and this is not a good movie to watch, and then of course there is the audience which watches or consumes. The question we need to ask about any cultural form is this one. You will remember a visual we have seen before of Agatha Christie's visual being superseded and overwhelmed by William Shakespeare. Now the question we can ask is, why is Agatha Christie not studied or taught in English departments when most people read Agatha Christie rather than read Thomas Hardy? That is, the question is asking us why a particular author who is so popular like Agatha Christie is not the subject of the syllabus, the curriculum, the teaching and the research, and why is it that most departments of English prefer to teach Thomas Hardy rather than Agatha Christie. A related question is, how does walking through the city streets, just wandering or roaming through malls become significant? Is it a cultural practice? What do the youth mean when they say they hang out at a shopping mall? What are the economic and political implications of any such development in cultural practices? That is, who benefits from selling you Shakespeare rather than sell you Christie? Who determines who will walk in the shopping mall or on the road? What are the economic and political implications of creating special outlets, exhibitions of tribal culture? That is, when tribal cultural artifacts are produced and marketed, who is able to afford them? Do the elite people want to purchase them in metropolises? Who makes the money out of selling these tribal artifacts? Cultural studies insists on a politics of reading, and this politics of reading is not about the text alone. It is not about watching a film alone by itself. It argues, and I am using the example here of a novel. A novel must be read not only within the form and conventions of other novels or the history of the novel, but also in other terms. That is, cultural studies insists that we see the novel as a social form, as something which has a social life, a social politics. So, in cultural studies, you need to look at and I am listing a few for you: the publishing industry and the profits. For example, how much money does Penguin Books make out of selling you a book? What is the profit margin? Who sells it? For how much? We need to look at the community of reviewers. Who writes about this book, in which page, on which newspapers' columns. We need to look at the academic field of literary criticism, by which I mean, how does a book get acceptable, get respectable when it is taught in a university or a college. Finally, there is the politics of awards. We hear frequently of a particular book having won the Booker, the Crossword, the Nobel, and so on and so forth. Awards are political, but they are also economic. That is, when a book receives a particular award, it sells that particular book. If you go to bookshops, you will frequently discover books with a little logo, with a little stamp on them, winner of the Man Booker Prize 2004. What does it do? When you go to a bookshop and discover a book with such a label on it, you are inclined to buy it. In other words, what I am proposing is, we need to understand how a recognition such as an award actually has an economic role, has an economic impact. The book is sold because it has won an award. To summarize that, cultural studies believes that we cannot read any cultural artifact, whether it is a film, a novel, a book, only within the aesthetic realm. To go back to what I have elaborated before, what culture studies asks you to do is to look at all cultural practices. It could be a TV show, it could be IPL, it could be a film, it could be a novel. We need to look at all these cultural artifacts, cultural practices as of course aesthetic products, but we also need to understand that they are economic products, they are political products. Films have a social life, books have a political role. If you were to list what we have looked at in the form of points, this is what we can summarize it as. Cultural studies looks at the language through which meanings are made in a particular culture. It then asks, how are such meanings going to reflect the power struggle within that particular culture? It explores how specific meanings are privileged, that is, how certain meanings are deemed to be more authentic, more regular and acceptable in that culture when it actually marginalizes some others. There are 6 or 7 main domains in cultural studies analysis. By domains I mean methodology and the way in which cultural studies works. The first is what we have just looked at, language and discourse. It looks at the question of identity. It looks at everyday life. Everyday life, we need to clarify what we understand. Everyday life is a question of, say, transportation, whether you travel by bus, by local trains, walking or your own vehicle. Everyday life is about the film posters you see on the way to your workplace. It's about where you get your lunch. Everyday life involves looking at even what has always been deemed stupid or irrelevant. For example, boredom. Everyday life consists of a great deal of boredom in waiting for a bus. The next domain is ethnography, which is a highly specialized form that overlaps with anthropology. It looks at media studies. It looks at reception and audience studies. Who is reading what? Who is watching a television serial? How many people have gone to watch a film? Finally, it looks at a specific category of professionals, marketing and publicity industry. The larger term used to describe them is cultural intermediaries. What does a cultural intermediary do? Cultural intermediaries position a book, a film in a particular way so that we, as in the audience, receive it in a particular way. That is, a cultural intermediary mediates between the book and the reader. We shall now look at the circuit of culture, a term given by Stuart Hall. Any cultural artifact or practice is studied for 5 key elements. representation, identity, production, consumption and regulation. What does representation do? The question that public culture or culture studies or popular culture studies asks would be something like this: what does a film represent and how is a film represented? That is, what is the story, the theme, the imagery in a film, and how is the film circulated, represented to all of us as in the audience? It asks what kind of identity is promoted when you sell a particular product. Examples would be of these kinds. What kind of age group is targeted in advertisements? Do the car and mobile phone manufacturers target youth? What kinds of identity are given importance in television serials? For example, family, young professionals, youth or business culture. Let us take the example of cell phone manufacturers. If you were to do a cultural studies analysis of cell phone manufacturing units and companies, we should be asking the following questions. What are the policies in these companies? How is recruitment done? Does the company have a welfare policy in place? How much profit does the company make? Does the company project a democratic work culture? Does the management mix with the workers? Does the company cater to a specifically Indian context? From production and representation, if you move on to consumption, culture studies will ask the following questions. Who are the major buyers of these mobile phones? What are their income levels? Why would you buy a particular model and not a different one? Then questions of lifestyle. Is the choice of a particular model determined by fashion, taste or functionality? Do you as a user of a cell phone upgrade models? That is, the summary question would be something like this. What are the meanings associated with particular models of mobile phones? Is a mobile phone about status, power or class identity? If you look closely at what I have just listed here for you, the questions are not about whether it is a more efficient phone, whether it is a more functional phone. The phone becomes a symbol of something else, whether it is of status, your class affiliation or your identity. Let us take the most famous marketing phenomenon of the 20th century, that too of a book, the Harry Potter books. If you were to look at Harry Potter as a book, as a film, then you must understand that you cannot separate the book from the character, the author from the actor and the merchandise that goes with it. On your screen, what you are seeing is the actor who plays Harry Potter, the author who wrote the book, a cover of a book, the visual from the book itself and the film version. What you need to understand is you can't separate any of them. They all come together. What you see coming together is the combined effect which is called Harry Potter. In other words, what we need to understand is that all notions received and otherwise of Harry Potter involves being aware of all of these things. The story of J.K. Rowling, the story of the boy who plays the hero in the story, how the book has been manufactured, how it is sold, how it has been marketed in secrecy and how people have been driven to buy it. How have you been told? How have you been persuaded to buy it? Please notice what we are looking at here is not the book itself. We are not looking at the film. What we are looking at is a set of marketing strategies through which it appeals to your emotion. You are told to read the new Harry Potter is mandatory. You are convinced that reading Harry Potter makes you part of a very elite group. You will remember that people lined up to buy the book. They stayed awake through the night, waited outside the bookstore to buy it. There was considerable secrecy as to what the plot of the final installment would be like. All of this adds to what I am referring to as a mystic element, the mystifying of Harry Potter. Our next topic is a cultural theory that emerged in the late 80s and early 1990s called the New Historicism. Its roots are in French and continental theories such as post-structuralism, discourse studies, the writings of Michel Foucault on medicine, the prison and the law, and new developments in the theory of history writing from Hayden White. And it has two related movements. One can be talked of as cultural poetics and the next as cultural materialism. What must be kept in mind is cultural materialism is a term used to describe the New Historicism as it is practiced in the United Kingdom. The New Historicism has specific assumptions, and some of these assumptions, if you can recall our earlier section, has overlaps with cultural studies as well. What are these assumptions? The most prominent one is this: cultural forms, cultural practices are linked to material conditions, social relations, production and profits. By material conditions, New Historicism provides us with a slightly Marxist angle to it. We are looking at material conditions in which a film is produced, a novel is written, a novel is marketed. Material conditions refer to the way in which it is sold to us as in the audience. Second assumption: the culture of a given period seeks to serve the interests of the dominant class. Once again, you see the influence of Marx here. What is being suggested here is that most forms of culture serve the interests of an elite group, of a particular dominant class. Though of course there are many forms of culture that try to subvert these. We can think of resistance cultures and working class cultures that seem to go against the interests of the dominant class. Finally, all culture is about power. Now, when you think about this, this is an argument that comes primarily from both Marx and Michel Foucault. All culture is about power, and the dominant classes who wish to keep the subjugated groups in their lowly position use certain cultural forms and practices. Now, what does the New Historicism actually do? The New Historicism locates power relations in society as they are reflected in literary and other texts of the period. What do we mean by this? It means simply a very Marxist interpretation of any literary or cultural text. The argument goes like this: all texts reflect existing social realities. All cultural texts reflect the power relations and power struggles in a particular society. Second, the New Historicism suggests that texts are used to conceal social conditions as well. That is, texts do not necessarily tell you the real social conditions, they mask them, they conceal them. What's interesting is the New Historicism looks at all textual representation as a two-way process. If social conditions are reflected in a particular text, then New Historicism suggests that the text also influences social conditions. It influences the way we think, the way we live. Therefore, what is to be done? The New Historicism proposes that text and context must be read together. They must be read into each other as sites of power relations. One cannot separate texts as just imaginative literature. That is, you cannot think of reading Wordsworth or Coleridge, Shakespeare or the 20th century Eliot as just doing imaginative work. No, we need to locate Eliot or Shakespeare or Wordsworth or Keats within their particular context and connect them to other texts. This leads us to an important development within New Historicism, and that is the connection between texts and history. The New Historicism, the title itself should tell you this, it's a new way of looking at history itself, the New Historicism. History is not a background. History is not a background against which texts are written. No, what you need to do is to look at history and the text as mutually dependent, as interdependent. History borrows from texts, influences texts. Texts look at history, borrow from history. A literary text, therefore, not only reflects an age, it shapes the age. How does it shape an age? Any literary text persuades people, informs the way they think, alters their beliefs, so that the context also changes. So, the literature of, say, the freedom movement, the literature of anti-colonial struggles somehow shapes and influences the people. We do know that all literary texts have had some impact on somebody. What new historicism suggests is a very simple shift. It asks us to think of texts as having a social and political impact. Literature that contributes to the construction of particular views, beliefs and values of, say, masculinity, the nation, the feminine, knowledge or whatever. So, if we are to read a literary text, then we need to pay attention to the following: the nature of publication, that is the production of the book, including things like marketing and publicity. What is the literacy level? Now, let us spend a couple of moments on the second one. Let us not forget that Shakespeare, arguably the greatest playwright the world has ever seen, was not writing to be read. Shakespeare was writing to be watched. It is something we tend to forget. You see, in the early modern period when Shakespeare is writing, in the 16th century specifically, very few people actually read Shakespeare. In fact, there were very few people who read. What is important is Shakespeare wrote his plays so that they could be staged, so that they could be watched. The literacy of the early modern England period that we are looking at is not print literacy, it is not verbal literacy, it is visual literacy. This is the reason why Shakespeare's plays do not readily give us suggestions as to how the print form works. It gives us lots of suggestions how the drama works or how it works on stage. Then we need to look at the kind of reader the book targets. For whom is the detective novel written? For whom is J.K. Rowling's work written? Next, what is the aura of the author? Now, you will recall we have already looked at the centrality of J.K. Rowling in the selling of Harry Potter. Her story of how she was a single mother, how she wrote in a cafe, how she put the pages away day after day and eventually found a publisher. In effect, what you see is the author's glory, the author's aura somehow is transmitted to the book. Next, the book in other cultural forms like cinema. Finally, how does a book get reviewed? How does a book get received? So, we need to look at a novel's academic acceptance, the relationship of the book to the genre itself, the relationship of this book to other books, and finally to contemporary topics and issues. This means if one were to read the Harry Potter books, we need to pay attention to the hype and the publicity, the aura of the author J.K. Rowling, her famous rags to riches story, the single parent status and so on and so forth. The merchandising, which includes the toys, the t-shirts, the brooms that have been sold in markets ever since the books came out. The debates about the book's relationship with other famous fantasy writings like Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. We need to look at the film version and the Hollywood industry that has generated so much profit around the Harry Potter character. We need to also look at the response of other famous authors like A.S. Byatt and Stephen King. How does the child get constructed as a consumer who desperately needs to read Harry Potter? We need to look at the contemporary revival of magic and fantasy, the theme of religious discourse that comes out in and around the books itself. What does cultural poetics then involve? It involves a study of practices like literature, music or film, the history of that particular cultural practice, the location of that cultural formation within other social domains such as law, politics and religion, and the linking of one cultural practice with another. Let us take the cultural poetics of the British Empire in India. This means studying cultural practices like the shikar, clubs, dancing, the Nautch girls, the history of each practice. How did each or any of these practices tie in with the imperial structure built on administrative military power and racial difference? We need to look at the common discourses of masculinity, leisure, and a public culture of imperial spectacle. Cultural materialists emphasize dissident readings, readings that have subverted, symbolically at least, the structures of power. We need to look at how the present concerns with exploitation, emancipation of power can be read back into the historical context. Its key focus is and has remained since the 80s that all representation is fundamentally political. There is no such thing as a neutral interpretation. The potential for subculture or countercultural resistance is always built into any cultural practice. Cultural materialism of the UK variety focuses on 4 key components or methods. First, the historical context. It looks at the conditions in which any particular text is produced and received. It looks at the theoretical method in a very rigorous way. A text will be read across disciplines because, according to the cultural materialists, discourses cut across texts. It's involved politically in its reading. All readings for the cultural materialists must exhibit a political commitment towards marginalized groups. Finally, cultural materialism relies heavily on textual analysis, a very close reading of texts.
If you have any comments, suggestions, or queries, feel free to write to us at this address: the Director, Directorate of Distance Education, Maulana Azad National Urdu University, Gachibowli, Hyderabad 500032. Thank you for being with us. Until we meet again next time, take care and bye.